Ford, General Motors, Volvo. These are just a few of the many automakers that are going all in on electric vehicles. With efforts to go green surging across the U.S., it may only be 15 or 20 years before gasoline-powered cars become obsolete. After all, this new tech offers several benefits.
They reduce emissions, they require less maintenance than gas-powered vehicles, and they can also help lower people's transportation costs. There can also be healthcare benefits associated with that. If there's reduced pollution, there can be reduced healthcare costs that are otherwise associated with that pollution.
That's Alessandra Carrion, manager of the Carbon-Free Mobility Team at the Rocky Mountain Institute. She points out that transportation is still the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our country, which is a direct contributor to climate change. One way to reduce these emissions is by going electric, and many Americans are willing to make the switch. The only problem is most electric cars are still way too expensive for the average person. And with the supply chain disruptions from the pandemic causing short supply and high demand for cars, that problem is only getting worse.
Automakers have been prioritizing production of high revenue units. So that means that a larger share of the current vehicle sales are luxury vehicles or are vehicles that are sort of the top trim line. So we get a much higher average vehicle price right now. And that's true in the EV segment too. Some of the first models out are the luxury models or the top of the line models. And then once they've satisfied the first people off the lists, and they have more supply, more chips, more batteries, more everything that they need, then they can start making more of the models that are more affordable.
That's Kristen Dichek, an automotive policy advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Detroit branch. Both she and Carrion believe that the shift to EVs is currently leaving low-income communities behind. While electric vehicles are cheaper long-term, the upfront costs are much higher. According to CNBC, the average cost to buy an electric car is roughly $56,000. For most Americans, that price tag is far out of reach. To make matters worse, charging these new models isn't accessible for everyone either. Right now, public EV charging facilities are mainly located in cities or in higher-income communities.
Accessibility to chargers, again, is extremely important because after overcoming the barrier of affording the vehicle, there has to be a way for drivers to charge those. And so in terms of efforts that can help alleviate that, there are a couple of areas where offering charging infrastructure is really important and often a barrier to increasing EV adoption. And one is at multi-unit dwellings. So how do you make sure that lower income, but actually people of all income levels who live in multifamily housing have access to chargers if they don't have a private garage? And then secondly is access to fast charging. So even if a person may not be able to charge their vehicles at home, or say if they have a workplace that offers charging, the ability to charge a vehicle very quickly through what are known as direct current fast chargers is another way for people who drive electric vehicles to have access to the power they need.
In the near future, it seems likely that every new housing complex, shopping center, or university building will be required to have EV chargers. But until that day comes, those without a home charger will have to rely on public charging stations. And right now, there simply aren't enough.
Folks like to think about they want a car. If they're switching to electric, they want an electric vehicle that will get them as far as a tank of gas. Folks who are going most longer distances are going to have to rely on a public charging network. And there are companies that are investing in building out charging, and they're going to do that in the places where it's most lucrative to do so.
One way the federal government is stepping in is through the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. This recent legislation grants a $7,500 tax credit to Americans who purchase an electric vehicle. On top of this, President Biden has awarded funding to 35 states to build out charging networks along interstate highways. And all of this legislation is targeted toward low-income census tracts and non-urban areas in the hopes that this new technology can spread to the masses.
There are credits for used EVs. There are credits for commercial clean vehicles. There's manufacturing tax credits for companies that make battery cells and modules. There's tax credits for expanding production facilities to make batteries or to make battery electric vehicles or low carbon vehicles.
The sourcing and material requirements in this new legislation also aim to bring more clean energy jobs directly to the U.S. instead of shipping them out abroad. To further incentivize electric cars, states like California and New York are requiring that by 2035, all new vehicles sold should be zero-emission vehicles. But to make this a reality, both Diczek and Carry-On agree that it's imperative to focus on infrastructure and accessibility.
There's an expectation or projection that EVs and internal combustion engine, also known as gas-powered vehicles, will reach price parity before 2030. So one of the most expensive, or the most kind of expensive part of the EV is actually the battery, and battery costs are going down. So within the next few years, we can anticipate that the price between vehicles will be about the same. And so now that amplifies why it's so important to focus on infrastructure.
Some car dealerships are selling used electric cars for a much lower upfront cost. But this is a rarity. If you're looking for a new vehicle and want to see which cars qualify for a tax credit, visit fueleconomy.gov. To find out more about Alessandra Carry-On, Kristen Diczek, and all of our guests, head over to viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galante. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
The broccoli lobby isn't a very powerful political force, whereas the cattle lobby really is, and the sugar lobby really is.
Rebalancing our food production efforts. Then,
I think life should be enjoyed. And I think that there are pretty simple habits we can build into our lives that can make any given day feel better.
The time management habits that stack up to make a big difference. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.